The morning sun beat down on Detective James Morrison's back as he stood at the edge of Death Valley. His boots sank slightly into the hot sand while he stared at the strange burn marks on the ground. What had started as a normal morning patrol had quickly turned into something much stranger. "Hey, Detective, you need to see this." Officer Tom Baker's voice carried across the empty desert. Morrison turned around and walked carefully toward his partner, trying not to disturb any potential evidence in the sand. 20 feet away from the burn marks lay a body. But this was unlike any body Morrison had seen in his 15 years on the force. The woman looked as if she was sleeping, her features perfectly preserved despite the harsh desert heat that should have caused severe damage. She wore a blue dress that seemed both modern and old-fashioned at the same time, with no signs of wear or fading. "This doesn't make sense," Morrison muttered, pulling out his scanner. The year was 2170, and every dead body should show up in the global identity database. He waved the device over the woman's face, waiting for the familiar beep that would tell him who she was. The scanner remained silent. Morrison knelt down beside the body, his trained eyes taking in every detail. The woman appeared to be in her mid-30s, with features that could have belonged to any number of Earth regions. But it was what he saw on her arms that made him catch his breath. Strange equations covered her skin, looking like tattoos, but somehow seeming to shift and change as he watched them. The symbols were like nothing he had ever seen before. Not Chinese, not Arabic, not any Earth language he knew. "Baker, call it in," Morrison ordered, not taking his eyes off the equations. "And get me a quantum containment field. Something's very wrong here." As Baker hurried back to their hover car, Morrison noticed something else. Despite lying in the open desert, there was no sand on the woman's body or clothes. It was as if she had been placed there moments ago, but their sensors would have detected any vehicles or transport signatures in the area. The containment field hummed to life around them as more officers arrived. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert as Morrison stood guard over his mysterious discovery. He had worked hundreds of cases in Death Valley, from regular deaths to smuggling operations, but something about this one felt different. The woman's face seemed almost familiar, like someone he had seen in an old photograph or a dream. Dr. Helen Ross, the department's medical examiner, arrived within the hour. Her usual confident expression faltered as she examined the body. "Jim," she said, using Morrison's first name, something she never did at crime scenes, "you need to see these readings." Morrison looked at her scanner display and felt his stomach drop. According to the medical sensors, the woman had been dead for both 2 hours and 200 years at the same time. "That's impossible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were living in a world where impossible things happen more and more often. Ever since the discovery of temporal energy in 2165, the rules of reality had become increasingly flexible. A small quantum-encrypted device fell from the woman's pocket as they lifted her body into the transport container. Morrison picked it up carefully, noting its weight and the strange warmth it gave off. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from a blocked number. He answered it, and a computerized voice spoke 5 words that made his blood run cold. Some mysteries should stay unsolved. The call ended before he could respond. Around him, the desert wind picked up, blowing sand in circles that seemed just a little too perfect to be natural. Morrison looked again at the woman's face, peaceful in death, and made a decision. Whatever this was, whoever she was, he would find the truth. As the transport lifted off with its mysterious cargo, Morrison noticed one last detail. In the sand where the body had been lying, a pattern had formed. From ground level, it looked like random marks, but the hovercar's camera showed the full image, a perfect replica of a case file cover from 1970, complete with a case number and a location: Isdal Valley, Norway. The desert wind erased the pattern before Morrison could take a picture, but he knew what he had seen. This wasn't just a murder case. This was something much bigger, and somehow a mystery from 2 centuries ago had found its way to his desert. Agent Linda Thompson walked into the morgue with purpose in her steps. The clean white walls and bright lights of the facility were a stark contrast to the desert where they had found the body. As the lead agent of the Temporal Investigation Bureau's Western Division, she had seen many strange cases, but this one made her uneasy. Detective Morrison stood by the examination table, his face showing the same confusion she felt. The woman's body lay between them, still looking as perfect as when they found her in Death Valley. "Tell me what you know," Thompson said, pulling out her datapad. She liked to write things down the old way, with a stylus, finding that it helped her think better. "Not much to tell," Morrison replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "No ID, no matches in any database, and DNA results that make no sense." He handed her a report, his hand slightly shaking. Thompson read the results and felt her heart skip a beat. The woman's genetic code contained elements that didn't exist on the periodic table. "This is new," she said quietly. She had investigated temporal anomalies for 12 years, but she had never seen anything like this. Dr. Ross entered the room, carrying a clear container. Inside it was a hotel keycard, the quantum-encrypted device they had found with the body, and a small notebook. "You'll want to see this," she said, placing the container on a nearby table. The keycard was from the Mojave Stellar Resort, a fancy hotel that catered to both Earth tourists and off-world visitors. The date stamp showed 2170, but the card's edge wore the kind of wear that took centuries to develop. Thompson picked up the notebook next, its pages filled with what looked like shopping lists in 12 different languages. "The interesting part isn't what's in the notebook," Dr. Ross said. "It's what we found when we scanned it." She pressed a button on her lab computer, and a hologram appeared above the notebook. Hidden between the written lines were strings of code, visible only under quantum light. Morrison whistled softly. "What does it say?" "That's just it," Thompson replied, studying the code. "It's not in any language we know, but look at this pattern. It's similar to the equations we found on her skin." The quantum-encrypted device proved just as mysterious. Every attempt to open it had failed, but it gave off a strange energy signature that their instruments couldn't properly measure. It was like trying to weigh air with a ruler. The tools they had simply weren't made for whatever this was. "I need to make a call," Thompson said, stepping into the hallway. She pressed her thumb against her phone's security scanner and waited as it connected to the Bureau's highest security line. "Director Williams," she said when the call connected. "We have a situation that matches case file 1970 Norway." "Yes, sir." "The exact same patterns." "No, sir. I don't think it's a coincidence." When she returned to the morgue, Morrison was examining the hotel keycard under a microscope. "Found something," he said without looking up. "There's a date stamped on the magnetic strip. November 29, 1970. The same day they found the first body in Norway." Thompson said. She walked to the examination table and looked again at the woman's face. 2 bodies, 2 centuries apart, with the same markings and the same evidence patterns. This isn't just a murder investigation anymore. Morrison nodded slowly. "We need to visit that hotel." "Agreed." Thompson gathered the evidence into her secure case. "But first, we need to talk about what really happened in Norway in 1970. The parts that never made it into the official reports." As they left the morgue, the quantum device in Thompson's case began to hum softly, its tone matching perfectly with the frequency of human brainwaves during deep sleep. Neither of them noticed the woman's right hand had moved slightly, her finger now pointing to a series of numbers hidden in the equations on her arm. 23 to 11/21/70. Tomorrow's date. The Mojave Stellar Resort rose from the desert like a giant crystal, its surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun. Agent Thompson and Detective Morrison stood in the massive lobby, watching tourists from Earth and other worlds move around them. The hotel's artificial waterfall caught the light, creating small rainbows in the air. "Welcome to the Mojave Stellar," said a friendly voice behind them. They turned to see Robert Hayes, the hotel's AI security chief. He looked completely human except for the slight blue glow in his eyes. "I understand you're here about our mystery guest." Thompson nodded, showing her badge. "We need to see all records of her stays." Hayes led them to the security office, a room filled with floating screens showing different parts of the hotel. He waved his hand, and the screens changed to show guest records. "This is where it gets strange," Hayes said. "Over the past 3 months, she checked in 11 times, each time with a different name, different ID, different everything. But it was definitely the same woman." Morrison leaned forward, studying the names: Mary Smith, Alice Jones, Emma Davis, Ruth Wilson, and others. All normal names, but something about them seemed off. "Show us the security footage," Thompson said, pulling out her notepad. The screens filled with videos of the woman. In one, she spoke perfect Russian to a group of space traders. In another, she was talking Japanese with some tourists. A third showed her speaking an alien language that even the hotel's universal translators couldn't understand. "That's impossible," Morrison said. "Nobody can speak that many languages perfectly." "It gets weirder," Hayes replied. He showed them more footage. The woman appeared to be having conversations with empty air, but the hotel's heat sensors showed shapes there, shapes that disappeared when anyone got close. Thompson watched closely. "Can you show us her room?" They took the elevator to the 42nd floor. Room 4217 looked normal at first, a luxury suite with a view of the desert. But their equipment started acting strange as soon as they walked in. Morrison's scanner showed the room existing in 3 different time periods at once. "Look at this," Thompson said, pointing to the wall. Faint marks covered the expensive wallpaper, the same equations they had found on the woman's skin. Hayes touched the wall, his AI systems scanning the marks. "According to my records, she spent hours writing these equations, then would erase them before housekeeping arrived. But they left impressions in the wall itself." Morrison walked to the window. "How did she pay for all this? Luxury suites aren't cheap." "That's another mystery," Hayes said. "She paid in old-style gold coins. Each coin was dated 1970, but when we tested them, they showed signs of being made last week." Thompson opened her secure case and took out the quantum device they had found with the body. As soon as it entered the room, it began to glow. The equations on the wall glowed in response. "Everyone out," Thompson shouted. They rushed into the hallway just as a bright flash filled the room. When they looked back in, the equations on the wall had changed. Hayes's eyes flickered as he scanned them. "They're coordinates now," he said, "but not for any place on Earth. And look at the time stamp. It's for next week." Morrison looked at Thompson. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" "In the Norway case." Thompson nodded slowly. In 1970, they found similar coordinates in the original Isdal Woman's hotel room. Those coordinates led to a place that didn't exist yet. This hotel. The quantum device hummed louder, and a small hologram appeared above it. It showed a woman, their mystery woman, walking through the hotel lobby. But the date stamp on the image read November 29, 1970. "She's not just traveling between hotels," Thompson said quietly. "She's traveling between times." As if in response, all the lights in the hotel flickered. When they came back on, room 4217 had changed. The modern furniture was gone, replaced by items from 1970. On the bed lay a newspaper, its headlines fresh and clear, dated the day the first Isdal woman was found. Morrison picked up the paper with shaking hands. "I don't think we're dealing with 2 different women," he said. "I think they're the same person." Dr. Emily Parker's office at the Quantum Archaeology Lab was filled with old books and new technology. Screens floated in the air, showing different time periods like windows into the past. She stood in front of the largest screen, comparing 2 images: the equations from their mystery woman's skin and a photograph from 1970. "They're exactly the same," she said, as Thompson and Morrison watched. Not similar, not close, exactly the same, down to the smallest mark. Morrison rubbed his tired eyes. They had been at this for hours. How is that possible? It's not, Dr. Parker replied. At least, it shouldn't be. These marks are like fingerprints. No one can copy them perfectly, unless they're from the same person. Thompson finished. She had seen enough strange things in her career to know that impossible things sometimes happened. Dr. Parker nodded and touched one of the floating screens. A new image appeared, a 3D model of time itself, showing waves and patterns like an ocean seen from above. Look here, she said, pointing to a spot where the waves made a perfect circle. This is our time, 2170. And here, she pointed to another circle, is 1970. The equations create a bridge between these points. Morrison walked closer to the screen. A time bridge. More like a loop, Dr. Parker explained. The woman dies in Norway in 1970, but somehow she also dies in Death Valley in 2170. The same woman, the same marks, the same mystery. She's trapped in a cycle. Thompson pulled out the quantum device they had found with the body. Can you analyze this? Dr. Parker placed the device on her scanning table. Blue light washed over it, and more data appeared on the screens. This is amazing, she whispered. This device isn't just recording time. It's holding it in place. In place? Morrison asked. Think of time like a river, Dr. Parker said. It usually flows in one direction. But this device creates a small pool, a place where time moves in a circle instead of a line, and our mystery woman is caught in that pool. Suddenly, all the screens flickered. The quantum device began to pulse with a soft blue light. Words appeared on the main screen, typing themselves. The ELOP must remain unbroken. That's not me doing that, Dr. Parker said, stepping back from her computer. More words appeared, 1970 and 2170, Ari antiquo or pointis, the mystery pirarutects, the timey line. Thompson reached for the device, but Morrison caught her arm. Wake, he said. Look at the equations again. On the screen showing the woman's skin markings, the equations were changing. Numbers shifted and reformed, creating a new pattern. Dr. Parker quickly scanned them. They're coordinates, she said, not just for places, but for moments in time. Hundreds of them, all between 1970 and 2170. She wasn't just traveling between 2 points. She was traveling throughout the entire timeline. But why? Morrison asked. Why create such a complex mystery? Dr. Parker's face went pale as she studied the new data. Because something happens between these two dates, something big. These equations, they're holding something in place. If we solve the mystery, if we break the loop, everything falls apart, Thompson finished. She had seen temporal disasters before, but nothing like this. The quantum device hummed louder, and a small hologram appeared above it. It showed their mystery woman, but younger, writing in a notebook. The date stamp read 2025. She's still out there, Morrison said, not just in the past or future, but right now, somewhere in the timeline. Dr. Parker nodded. And she left us these clues for a reason. Not to solve the mystery, but to understand why it has to stay a mystery, Thompson said quietly. The screens went dark, then lit up with one final message. Som DORS must stay CLOCD to key EPT universi CF. In the silence that followed, they could hear the quantum device ticking, like a clock counting down to something. Or maybe, Thompson thought, counting up from something that had already happened. The old house sat alone on a hill overlooking the city. Thompson and Morrison climbed the creaking steps to meet Michael Anderson, a retired temporal physicist who had contacted them after seeing news about their case. Anderson opened the door before they could knock. He was tall and thin, with white hair and eyes that seemed to see through time itself. I've been waiting for you, he said. For about 50 years, actually. They followed him into a study filled with old photographs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. There, on every wall, were pictures of their mystery woman. Different times, different places, but always the same face. "You knew her," Morrison said. It wasn't a question. Anderson nodded, sitting down in an old leather chair. "I met her first in 1975. Then again in 1992, and 2030, and 2112. He smiled sadly. She never aged, never changed. But she was always running. Running from what? Thompson asked, taking out her notepad. Not from. Toward. Anderson stood and walked to a bookshelf. He pulled out an old notebook, its pages yellow with age. "Have you heard of the Cronus Initiative?" Morrison shook his head, but Thompson's face went pale. "That's just a myth," she said. "A story they tell new agents to scare them." "It's real," Anderson said. "I know because I was part of it. We were a group dedicated to protecting time itself. When people invented time travel, they thought they could fix the past, save loved ones, stop wars. But each change created ripples that threatened to tear reality apart." He opened the notebook, showing them complex diagrams. "We created special agents, people who could move through time and stop others from changing history. She was our best operative, the perfect agent." He paused, "until she found out the truth." "What truth?" Morrison asked. Anderson's hand shook as he turned the page. "That time isn't what we thought. It's not a line, or even a web. It's more like a house of cards. And the Isdal case, her case, is the card at the bottom. Remove it, and everything falls." Thompson leaned forward. "Why that case? What makes it so special?" "Because it's a perfect mystery," Anderson said. "No solution, no closure, just questions that create more questions. And those questions create a kind of stability, a temporal anchor point that holds reality together." Morrison walked to the wall of photographs. "So she didn't die in Norway." "She did, and she didn't, and she will, all at the same time." Anderson stood up and walked to a covered object in the corner. He pulled off the sheet, revealing a device identical to the one they found with the body. "She left these throughout time," he explained. "Each one helps maintain the loop, the mystery of who she was, where she came from. It's all part of the protection." "Protection from what?" Thompson asked. "From the truth that would destroy everything. The truth about why time travel was really invented, and what happened the first time someone tried to change the past." Anderson's voice grew quiet. "She discovered that our whole reality, everything we know, is actually a correction, a fix for a mistake that unmade the universe." The device in the corner began to hum. Anderson smiled sadly. "She's listening. She always is, moving through time, making sure the mystery stays unsolved." Morrison's phone buzzed. A message appeared. "Check the hotel room again." "How did you know she would contact us?" Thompson asked Anderson. "Because she already did. 50 years ago, she told me you would come today. Just like she told me to build this." He pointed to a wall safe. "Open it. The combination is the date you found her body." Thompson entered the numbers. Inside was a single photograph, taken yesterday, showing them standing in Anderson's study right now. "Time isn't just broken," Anderson said quietly. "It's been fixed. By her. And the mystery of who she is, the questions that can never be answered, that's what holds the fix in place." Michael walked down the dark hallway. He held his flashlight in front of him. The beam of light showed the way. The old floorboards creaked under his feet. Cobwebs brushed his face. He tried not to think about what might be lurking in the shadows. This house had been abandoned for many years. Local legends said it was haunted. They talked about strange noises coming from inside at night. There were stories of ghostly figures seen through the windows. Most people stayed far away from the decrepit structure. They thought it was cursed. But Michael didn't believe in curses or ghosts. He was curious about the old manor's secrets. He wanted to explore this spooky place, Maybe he would find something interesting inside, an old treasure or relic from the past. He had always been drawn to mysteries. His friends told him he was crazy to go into the haunted house alone, especially at night, but Michael was determined. He packed a bag with supplies and headed out at dusk. The old gate creaked open. Unruly vines and weeds covered the grounds. He made his way carefully to the front door. Now he was inside. The air smelled musty. A thick layer of dust covered everything. He stepped cautiously, testing the stability of the floor. Some parts looked very rotten. He didn't want to fall through to the basement. Faded portraits hung crookedly on the walls. The eyes seemed to follow him. Antique furniture sat unused for decades. Moth-eaten curtains blocked the windows. He felt a chill even though it was a warm summer night. This place gave him an uneasy feeling. But he pressed on. He climbed the grand staircase. It groaned under his weight. At the top, he found several closed doors. Where should he explore first? He chose one at random and pushed it open. The hinges screeched in protest. It was a bedroom, old-fashioned and covered in dust. A large four-poster bed took up most of the space. Michael saw something on the bed. He approached slowly. His heart beat faster. There was a shape under the blankets. He pulled the covers back quickly. A cloud of dust flew up. He coughed and waved it away. Then he saw what was beneath. He stumbled back in shock. It was a skeleton. The bones were yellowed with age. Rotted clothes still clung to the frame. Michael's mind raced. Who was this? How long had they been here? He looked around frantically. Then a glint caught his eye. There was something in the skeleton's hand. He leaned closer. It was a locket on a delicate chain. With shaking hands, he pried it loose. He opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny black and white photograph. He recognized the face. It was Elizabeth Blackwood, the lady of the house. She had disappeared mysteriously over 60 years ago. No one knew what happened to her. They assumed she ran off with a lover. But she had been here all along, a prisoner in her own home. Michael realized he had uncovered the manor's dark secret. But who had done this to Elizabeth? Why was she left to die alone? What other mysteries did this house contain? A sudden noise in the hallway made him jump. A floorboard creaking under invisible feet. His heart pounded. He tucked the locket in his pocket. It was time to get out of here. The shadows felt too threatening now. He didn't want to join Elizabeth in her sad fate. He ran down the stairs, through the house, and out the front door. He didn't stop until he reached his car. But even as he drove away, questions swirled in his mind. He knew he would have to go back. He had to solve the mystery, for Elizabeth's sake and for his own curious spirit. This version tells part of a story about a character named Michael exploring an old, supposedly haunted house. He discovers a skeleton that turns out to be a woman named Elizabeth who mysteriously disappeared 60 years ago. The story uses simple language and short paragraphs to tell the tale in the third-person perspective. Let me know if you would like me to modify or expand the story in any way. I can generate additional parts to continue the narrative if you'd like. Michael couldn't stop thinking about what he found in the old Blackwood Manor. The image of Elizabeth's skeleton was stuck in his head. He had so many questions. He needed to find answers. The next day, he went to the library. He searched through old newspapers and records. He looked for any information about the Blackwoods, especially Elizabeth's disappearance. He found an article from 1958. It said Elizabeth was last seen at a party at the manor. She danced and laughed. Then she went upstairs and never came back down. People thought she left with a secret lover. The article talked about Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Blackwood. He was a rich and powerful man. He owned many businesses in town. He had a reputation for being strict and controlling, especially with his wife. Michael also found Thomas's obituary. He died 10 years after Elizabeth vanished. The cause was listed as a heart attack. He was found dead in his study at the manor. Michael made copies of the articles and records. He took them home to study more. He had a gut feeling there was more to the story. He thought Thomas was involved in Elizabeth's disappearance. He went back to the manor the next night. This time he focused on the study. He dug through old papers and books, looking for any clues. In the back of a drawer, he found a letter. It was addressed to Elizabeth. The handwriting was shaky, like it was written by an unsteady hand. He opened it carefully. The letter was a confession from Thomas. He admitted to killing Elizabeth in a fit of rage. She told him she was leaving him for another man. He lost control and strangled her. Then he hid her body and pretended she ran away. Michael's hand shook as he read Thomas's words. He felt sick. Poor Elizabeth, trapped in a loveless marriage, murdered for wanting freedom, left to rot in the place she hated. He put the letter in his pocket. He would take it to the police in the morning. Elizabeth's case was long cold, but maybe this would give her some justice, some peace. As he turned to leave, he felt a sudden chill. The room turned icy. He could see his breath. Then he heard a voice. "Thank you," it whispered. It sounded like a woman. He turned around slowly. There in the corner stood a figure, transparent and glowing softly. It was Elizabeth. She smiled at him, then faded away. Michael blinked. Was that real? Or just his imagination? He wasn't sure. But he felt different, like a weight had lifted. He knew he had done the right thing. He took one last look around the study. Then he left the Blackwood Manor. He didn't feel the need to go back again. The ghosts could rest now. The truth was finally out. The next day, the old manor made headlines. Skeleton found in abandoned Blackwood house. Decades-old missing person case solved. Millionaire murdered wife in 1958. Michael read the articles with a solemn face. He wasn't mentioned. He told the police he wanted to stay anonymous. This wasn't about him. It was about Elizabeth. She could have the spotlight now. He did go to her funeral. The whole town showed up. They laid Elizabeth to rest in the family plot. Next to her husband, Michael thought it was wrong. She deserved to be far away from him, free even in death. As he walked away from the fresh grave, he felt a warm breeze, gentle and comforting. He knew Elizabeth was at peace now. Her spirit was finally free. He had solved the mystery of the haunted manor, but more than that, he had righted an old wrong. And that felt pretty good. Michael climbed into his car and drove away, towards new adventures and mysteries. He would always remember Elizabeth Blackwood, and the night he met a real ghost, the night he set her free. This continuation stays in the third-person perspective and uses simple language to expand the story. It reveals that Elizabeth was murdered by her husband, and her ghost haunted the manor until Michael found the truth and brought her justice and peace. Please let me know if you would like me to modify or continue the story in any way. A few months passed. The story of the Blackwood Manor faded from the news, but Michael never forgot about Elizabeth or his experiences in that old house. It changed him, made him see the world a little differently. He continued to explore abandoned places, always searching for the truth behind the mysteries. He started a blog to share his adventures. He called it Forgotten Shadows. It gained a small but loyal following. One day, he got an email from a woman named Sarah. She said she had a strange story to share, and she thought Michael was the only one who would believe her. Sarah's grandfather had recently passed away. He left her an old key and a letter. The letter talked about a hidden room in his house, a room that held a dark secret. Sarah found the room, and what she saw inside terrified her. Michael was intrigued. He agreed to meet Sarah at her grandfather's house. It was a few hours' drive away, in a small town he had never heard of. When he arrived, Sarah greeted him at the door. She looked pale and shaken, like she hadn't slept in days. She led him inside and up to the attic. In the back corner, behind some boxes, was a small door. Sarah used the old key to unlock it. It opened with a creak. Inside was a narrow room, more like a large closet. The walls were lined with shelves. On the shelves were jars, dozens and dozens of jars. Each one held something floating in murky liquid. At first, Michael thought they were specimens, weird things pickled in jars, like in a mad scientist's lab. But as he looked closer, his stomach turned. The jars held human remains, fingers, toes, ears, eyes, even a couple hearts and a brain, each one labeled with a name and date. Sarah's grandfather had been a serial killer. For decades, his victims were mostly homeless people, drifters that no one would miss. He took trophies from each one and kept them hidden in this morbid collection. Michael felt sick. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. Sarah was shaking, tears running down her face. She didn't know what to do. Michael put a hand on her shoulder. This was a job for the police, not amateur sleuths like him. He convinced Sarah to call them. When the authorities arrived, they were just as shocked. They had never seen anything like it. The FBI was called in. It became a huge case. As Sarah and Michael gave their statements, a detective pulled them aside. He said Sarah's grandfather had left another letter, addressed to Michael. They had found it in the room. With trembling hands, Michael opened it. It was short and cryptic. It said, "Mr. Bates, I know what you did for Elizabeth Blackwood. I have watched you. You are like me. You see the truth in the shadows. You will continue my work. You will add to my collection." Michael dropped the letter. His head spun. What did this mean? He wasn't like this monster. He solved mysteries. He didn't create them. And he certainly didn't collect trophies from victims. The detective watched him carefully. Michael stammered out that he had no idea what the letter meant, that he had never met Sarah's grandfather. It must be a mistake. But as he drove away from that awful house, the letter haunted him. The killer had known about Elizabeth. Had he been watching Michael for months? Was this some sick invitation to join him? To become a monster too? Michael shook his head. No, he was nothing like that psycho. He helped people. He brought the truth to light. He wasn't tempted by the darkness. But a small, nagging doubt crept in. He did feel a thrill exploring shadowy places, delving into secrets and mysteries. Could that someday twist into something sinister? He pushed those thoughts away. He was a good person. He knew that, but he also knew he would be a lot more careful in the future. The world was full of shadows, and not all of them hid ghosts or treasures. Some hid real evil, and that was something to truly fear. This part introduces a dark twist, with Michael uncovering a serial killer's hidden collection and receiving a disturbing letter suggesting the killer saw a kinship with Michael. It ends with Michael grappling with some self-doubt, but ultimately deciding he is a fundamentally good person, while acknowledging he will be more cautious going forward. Let me know if you would like me to continue the story or modify this part in any way.